Here we want to be able to solve by completing the square. We have negative 3x squared plus 6x plus 11 equals 0. So in this particular question, let's go ahead and write this out. So we first see that it's already in standard form. So we have negative 3x squared plus 6x plus 11, and that's equal to 0. We always need to make sure that the leading coefficient is a 1. So the first thing we need to do is divide each term by negative 3. So we're going to divide each term by negative 3 of the equation. So now in step 2, we get a leading coefficient of 1 now, so we have x squared. Okay, positive 6 divided by negative 3 is negative 2x. And positive 11 divided by negative 3 is a negative 11 thirds. And then that's equal to 0. Okay, now we need to make sure that we have all the variable terms on the left side of the equation and all the constants on the right side. So we have x squared minus 2x. We're going to leave a space because we're going to add 11 thirds to both sides. So now we have 11 thirds on the right side. Now we need to complete the square by adding the n to both sides of the equation. Now remember, what does n equal? N is equal to 1/2 of the value of b, and then we're going to square it. So for step 2, n is going to equal 1/2. We notice that b is equal to negative 2. So 1/2 of negative 2, and then we're going to square it. Well, what's 1/2 of negative 2? Well, half of negative 2 is negative 1. And when we square negative 1, we get a positive 1. So then n is going to equal positive 1. Okay, now we're going to come back over here in step number 4 and then replace n to be positive 1. So we have x squared minus 2x plus 1. And that's going to equal 11 thirds plus 1. Okay. So now in step number 5, we need to factor because this is a perfect square trinomial. And remember, when we factor, we're going to have parentheses of a binomial and we're going to square it. Well, we know that this is going to be x, and then what did we have to square to get positive 1? Well, it was minus 1, so it's going to be x minus 1 squared. And then that's going to equal the following. Now we need to add these two fractions. The common denominator between those two is 3. So 3 times 1 gives us 3, so 11 times 1 is 11. 1 times 3 gives us 3, so 1 times 3 is 3. So we end up getting 11 plus 3, which is 14 over 3. Okay, now in step number 6, we're going to take the square root of both sides. So we have the square root of x minus 1 squared, and that's going to equal plus or minus the square root of 14 divided by the square root of 3. Okay, now on the left-hand side, we're going to end up with x minus 1, and that's going to equal the square root of 14 divided by the square root of 3. Now, we cannot leave the denominator with a radical, so we have to rationalize the denominator, which means we need to multiply the numerator and denominator by a factor of 1, which is the same thing as square root of 3 over the square root of 3. The reason why we use 3 is, well, 14 times 3, okay, is going to give us 42. And then the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 is the square root of 9. And now we end up with the square root of 42 divided by the square root of 9, which is 3. So now this becomes plus or minus the square root of 42 divided by 3. And now we're going to add 1 to both sides. So therefore, in step number 8, we get x, which is equal to 1 plus or minus the square root of 42 over 3. Now, if we want to make this a little bit more simplified, we can say that this 1 is the same thing as 3 over 3 plus or minus the square root of 42 over 3. And that's when we end up getting, and I'm going to go ahead and use that as one solution. And because they both have the same denominator, we can write this now as 3 plus or minus the square root of 42 over 3. That's another way of being able to write this answer. So let's go ahead and write our solution. So we have 3 plus or minus the square root of 42 over 3. Okay, so we have the fraction 3. We're going to use the plus or minus the square root of 42 over 3. Let's check our answer. And there is our result.